Hello and welcome back. We are in Exodus chapter 21. Just a couple of updates. We almost have the Facebook page ready. I'm working on a Patreon page to see if we can do like some weekly discussions. Maybe my daughter had suggested I review that week's messages or that week's lessons, and then we can kind of talk about them. It looks like Patreon might be the best way to go because there's a great way of kind of keeping the weirdos out, or the spam bots, or whatever you want to call them. So I'm looking into that. News is coming soon. You may actually find out about it before you even see this video, because some of them I should have done by then. So we'll see. But meanwhile, you can go to brandoncunningham.com and subscribe. Get these in your inbox. Share it with a friend. Tell everybody else about it. And we'll all learn together. That's the goal. So we're going to read Exodus chapter 21. I hope the videos on Exodus 20 didn't totally throw anybody off or make you want to just run for the hills, because we want to learn Scripture. So we're learning it together. Let's face the hard and the easy stuff at the same time. Let's not give up at what God really wants us to know. Chapter 21 is one of those chapters. It's a little long, so we're going to break it in half too, mostly because it's really important. So I want to make sure that we get it, that we don't just skip past it and think that we kind of know what it says, because it says a lot of stuff. So Exodus chapter 21, and I'll read it in the New Living Translation, just to kind of prove that, hey, this isn't a Hebrew wording thing. This is literally what it says, and it's easy to understand. We just don't like it sometimes. But here's what it says. These are the regulations you must present to Israel. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he may serve you for no more than 6 years. Set him free in the 7th year, and he will owe you nothing for his freedom. If he was single when he became your slave, he shall leave single. But if he was married before he became a slave, then his wife must be freed with him. If his master gave him a wife while he was a slave and they had sons or daughters, then only the man will be free in the 7th year, but his wife and children will still belong to his master. But the slave may declare, I love my master, my wife, and my children. I don't want to go free. If he does this, his master must present him before God. Then his master must take him to the door or doorpost and publicly pierce his ear with an awl. After that, the slave will serve his master for life. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she will not be freed until the end of 6 years, as the men are. If she does not satisfy her owner, he must allow her to be bought back again. But he is not allowed to sell her to foreigners, since he is the one who broke the contract with her. But if the slave's owner arranges for her to marry his son, he may no longer treat her as a slave, but as a daughter. If a man who is married has married a slave wife, takes another wife for himself, he must not neglect the rights of the first wife to food, clothing, and sexual intimacy. If he fails in any of these 3 obligations, she may leave him as a free woman without making any payment. Anyone who assaults and kills another person must be put to death. But if it was simply an accident permitted by God, I will appoint a place of refuge where that slayer can run for safety. However, if someone deliberately kills another person, then the slayer must be dragged even from my altar and put to death. Anyone who strikes father or mother must be put to death. Kidnappers must be put to death, whether they are caught in possession of their victims or have already sold them as slaves. Anyone who dishonors father or mother must be put to death. Now suppose 2 men quarrel and one hits the other with a stone or fist, and the injured person does not die but is confined to bed. If he is later able to walk outside again, even with a crutch, the assailant will not be punished but must compensate his victim for lost wages and provide for his full recovery. If a man beats his male or female slave with a club and the slave dies as a result, the owner must be punished. But if the slave recovers within a day or 2, then the owner shall not be punished, since the slave is his property. Now, suppose 2 men are fighting, and in the process, they accidentally strike a pregnant woman, so she gives birth prematurely. If no further injury results, the man who struck the woman must pay the amount of compensation the woman's husband demands, and the judges approve. But if there is further injury, the punishment must match the injury. A life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, a burn for a burn, a wound for a wound, a bruise for a bruise. If a man hits his male or female slave in the eye and the eye is blinded, he must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And if a man knocks out a tooth of his male or female slave, he must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. If an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox must be stoned and its flesh may not be eaten. In such case, however, the owner may not be held liable. But suppose the ox had a reputation for goring and the owner had been informed but failed to keep it under control. If the ox then kills someone, it must be stoned and the owner must also be put to death. However, the dead person's relatives may accept payment to compensate for the loss of life. The owner of the ox may redeem his life by paying whatever is demanded. The same regulation applies if the ox gores a boy or a girl. But if the ox gores a slave, either male or female, the animal's owner must pay the slave's owner 30 silver coins, and the ox must be stoned. Suppose someone digs or uncovers a pit and fails to cover it, and then an ox or a donkey falls into it. The owner of the pit must pay full compensation to the owner of the animal, but then he gets to keep the dead animal. If someone's ox injures a neighbor's ox and the injured ox dies, then the two owners must sell the live ox and divide the price equally between them. They must also divide the dead animal, but if the ox had a reputation for goring, yet its owner failed to keep it under control, he must pay full compensation, a live ox for the dead one, but he may keep the dead ox. So sometimes we read stuff like that and we think, what? Some of this stuff is just crazy. Slaves and oxes and piercing your slave. And I thought God was against this and God that. Well, here's the thing. Slavery then was very different than what we think in America as far as the African slave trade. It was not that at all. To be a slave as a Hebrew to another Hebrew, it meant you owed them money, basically. You could become essentially a bond servant, so to speak. So, and in some respects, it was almost like an employee. Now, I'm not trying to sugarcoat slavery or anything like that. I'm just saying it's not what you think of as slavery if you grew up in America. It's a completely different thing. God's still not for it, but he understood these are very new baby Christians, so to speak. They were just getting used to the idea of having a God and a God that wanted a relationship with them. And rather than say everything about your whole life has to change immediately, he put into place rules to, in some ways, make the process better for the slave, better for the person who was being subjected to certain things. Also, keep in mind, he put it at the very beginning in chapter 21. It's right after the Ten Commandments. So it was important to him, obviously. So it's important to remember too, chapter 21 begins with, now these are the rulings you are to present to them. This is one of those chapters that has some thoughts that can affect everything after it. The first word in Hebrew is actually va-ele, and it means, and these are. The term is a connecting term. Basically, it indicates that what's about to be said is a continuation of what was just said. So also, those are the kind of words we use. That's basically the same thing. It's a Christian view that Exodus 20 is totally disconnected from Exodus 21 because they want to keep the Ten Commandments, but not the laws and the rulings. But this is a view that's allowed that to be possible. They said basically this is all for the Hebrews, but we're going to keep the Ten Commandments. I basically say they don't even keep the Ten Commandments, so that's not good either. But the Ten Commandments are the first 10 laws. It's kind of like the preamble to our Constitution. The preamble, the opening words, are there, but they set up everything that happens after that. Everything in the Constitution flows through that filter, so to speak. So verse 1 reads in Hebrew, now these are the mishpat that you are to present to them, meaning Israel. So God characterizes all that follows as mishpat. And we're going to look at that. What is mishpat and tzaddik? We need to know what those words mean to help us kind of go forward. So misunderstanding that really colors how we see the rest of the Old Testament and also how it relates to the covenant of Christ. So it's really important. Some believers, they really focus on heaven and the afterlife, and they kind of leave our time here on earth as kind of secondary. It doesn't matter as much. We're all working to get to heaven. Can't wait to get to heaven. And all their attention is really on that. But Hebrews paid very little attention to heaven. That was not a thought. All their attention was on the here and now, how they live now in relation to God. And we find almost nothing about what happens when you die in the Old Testament. And the Hebrew view was death was just the natural end. You know, birth is a natural beginning and death is a natural end. Their fear was really being cut off, meaning like dying prematurely. And they felt like premature death was really a consequence of the way you're living, your unrighteous living and disobedience to the law. So if somebody died early, that's kind of the way they saw it. That was your punishment. But no real further consequences were contemplated after that because they figured death was the end of existence. So what happened after that didn't matter. Sheol, or what we've termed Hades or hell, was really to the Hebrew mind just a place of the dead. That's what they called it. It's considered like the Old Testament hell, but that's not really how they saw it. It was basically just a grave. That they didn't see any kind of punishment from it necessarily. But Sheol permanently separates the dead from Jehovah because he can't have any sin around him, any unclean, and death was the most unclean. So those separation thoughts kind of led Christian teachers to claim that Sheol was a place of punishment, that it's forever punishment because you're separated from God. But the Old Testament says that all descend to Sheol. So basically, we all go to the grave. That's all it says. Sheol was viewed as the common denominator. Righteous or wicked, all men died, no matter what. So what mattered really was life. It was living in the now. You didn't work towards getting somewhere. So virtually every culture had a cult kind of the dead. The pyramids, they were basically built so the Pharaoh could have a comfortable afterlife. They would put servants in there with him and food and water and all those things because they were expected to serve him in the afterlife. And the Old Testament, though, Hebrews believed the only way to serve God was in the life they were living in the here and now. So being righteous meant being obedient to him. So they worked to please Jehovah in their everyday activities, in every phase of life. So this was their life purpose. Whatever reward that came from that during their lifetime was based on obedience and their decisions to the law and to what God wanted. Christians really focus on our eternal future with God. We don't really think about how our day-to-day stuff really affects our relationship. But these two different views extend to how Hebrews and Christians see salvation too, that we see it very differently. Salvation to an observant Jew means something completely different than what we think, not how to get it, but what it is. Hebrews think of salvation as a fact by means of birth. I was born part of a set apart people, so I'm saved in a sense. God established the saved people through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And if you were a member of their clan, then you were saved. And so saved from what? If you weren't worried about going to hell or going to heaven, then what were you saved from? You were saved from being a pagan, from not being God's chosen people and living like people live in the world. So for the ancient Hebrew, being saved happened by remaining in the group by means of your dedication and obeying the law. Being born a Hebrew and being obedient to the law was your reward, so to speak. simply being part of God's people. We don't see it that. It's like God has rules. I don't like rules. I want to just say I'm a member, but I don't want to have to do what he says too. Hebrews didn't see it that way. Contrast this with the Christian view of salvation. Our reward takes place in the future after we die. The righteous Christians seek is to get us into heaven. The righteousness Hebrews hoped for was a day-to-day issue, with the reward knowing that you were obedient and you were pleasing to Jehovah, to God, and remained part of his set-apart people. Hebrews didn't have a works approach, although we've taught that at different times. It really involved an obedience righteousness approach, from a recognition that it was Jehovah's grace that made the Hebrews his chosen people. So out of an abundance of gratitude for that grace, they wanted to serve God the way he wanted to be served. Tradition has caused some to miss it, and most Hebrews rejected and continue to reject their need for salvation because they think they're already saved from being a pagan by being part of the set-apart people. It wasn't because they thought their righteousness earned them eternal life. That wasn't something they worried about. They believed that obedience to the covenants of Abraham and Moses assured them of that future, that they would be set apart forever. So this is why we need to examine our traditions and our doctrines, because they could make us miss Jesus and what God ultimately wants, just like the Jews did, because they thought they were right. They didn't think they were messing up or making a decision. They thought they were being obedient to what they had been taught in their synagogues and temple over hundreds of years, because they just believed tradition and oral law, halakha, was biblical, because they didn't know the Bible. We don't have that excuse. We can read the Bible all day, every day. We don't have an excuse to not know what it says. But the Hebrews were really more concerned with living out their faith, everyday activities. Rather than see righteousness as the goal, they saw it as an everyday matter of behavior. I should be righteous all day, every day. That should be my goal. Man's righteousness, his tzaddik, as we'll explore that word too, revolved around him being fair and equitable in his dealings. Then he didn't have to worry about it. They followed the law. Rather than what we did, as I was reading that, I'm sure in your mind you're like, well, that's not right. I don't like that. We don't have the ability to question God's laws. We only get to decide whether we want to be obedient to them. And we don't get to decide if we want to be obedient to some of them, maybe 500 of them, but not 613 of them. That's not a thing either. If God said it, it's right. And if we don't like it, we're wrong. That's just the way it is. So I think that both are a little right and wrong. What we call the law, Jehovah calls his mishpat. So what is that? Let's look at an incident with Abraham. In Genesis 18:19, it says this: "For I, Jehovah, have made myself known to him," Abraham, "so that he will give orders to his children and to his household after him to keep the way of Jehovah, to do what is right and just, so that Jehovah may bring about for Abraham what he has promised him." So in Hebrew, to do tzaddik and mishpat means to keep the way of Jehovah. By doing tzaddik and mishpat, doing what is right and just, one is keeping the way of Jehovah. It's following it to get the righteousness that God presents to us by following his rulings, the things he wants us to do. The way of Jehovah is not harsh, a rigid law code, nor is it negative. 600 years ago, when the Bible was first translated into English, judgment was kind of a neutral term. I was having this conversation this morning. It meant someone asked your opinion and you responded, well, in my judgment. Now we've changed that in English to mean basically some sort of condemnation or a wrath. But in my judgment didn't mean in my wrath. It just meant that you had come to a conclusion. This is what I think you should do, or this is my opinion on the matter. This is what God's doing. He's giving his opinion on things, and we get to choose whether we follow that or not. If you follow the God of Israel, Yeshua, Jehovah, follow his rules. Don't question them. But God's righteousness, is about salvation. When righteousness, Zodic, which means basically the same thing as of God, it's referring to his saving will and his decision to create a set apart people, a saved people, a redeemed people. So God's saving will is intended for us. So a righteous man is one whom God's saving will is being carried out. We would say, since Christ, that a righteous man is a believer, one who has accepted God's saving will, because that's what Jesus the Christ is. It's God's saving will. He's presenting to us, we can accept it. Mishpat is the standard of what is right and good according to God. So if a man is doing God's mishpat, that means behaving according to the standard set by God as part of his saving will. Mishpat generally means to keep God's saving words. It means being obedient to his word. That's why we're studying it. In Isaiah 127, it says, Zion will be redeemed with judgment, and those who repent by righteousness. Zion is Israel. It's another word for Israel. Many versions say redeemed by justice, but Jehovah is not going to redeem Zion by visiting wrath, divine judgment upon them. He's going to exercise his rulings, his mishpat, his saving will, his form of justice upon them. And he tells us what that is. His mishpat is that man will not pay the penalty for our sins. Rather, Jehovah, in the person of Jesus Christ, that's key. You have to accept his word, is going to pay the price. That is God's mishpat, his form of justice. That is God's saving will. In Isaiah 42, 1-4, it says this, Here is my servant, whom I support, my chosen one, in whom I take pleasure. I have put my spirit on him, and he will bring the gospel to the Gentiles. He will not cry or shout, nor will one hear his voice in the streets. He will not snap off a broken reed or snuff out a smoldering wick. He will bring forth the gospel of truth. He will not weaken or be crushed until he has established the gospel on earth, and the coastlands wait for his Torah. What Hebrews and Christians have called the law is the ongoing process of the gospel. We think the gospel is beginning with Christ, but it was first established with the covenant with Abraham. In Galatians 3, we'll jump over to the New Testament. In Galatians 3, verse 6-8, Paul says this, It was the same with Abraham. He trusted in God and was faithful to him, and that was credited to his account as righteousness. Be assured then that it is those who live by trusting and being faithful who are really children of Abraham. Also, the Tanakh, the Old Testament, foreseeing that God would consider the Gentiles righteous when they live by trusting and being faithful, told the good news, the gospel, to Abraham in advance by saying, in connection with you, all the Goyim, which is Gentiles, Hebrew for Gentiles, will be blessed. So the gospel was first revealed to Abraham 2,000 years before Yeshua. And we don't ever learn that in church. So when you think about the law, the Torah, think of it as the original gospel. The Old Testament is the gospel, Act 1, and the New Testament is the gospel, Act 2. Revelation is the finale, gospel, part 3, or Act 3. Our lives are training where we learn and practice God's perfect way of justice, his mishpat and Zodic, found in his Torah. And Exodus 21:1 could read this, This is the gospel you are to present to them. It's the same thing. This is the development of the gospel. The gospel, Act 1, the gospel is the name we have given to information that makes known God's plan of salvation and our need for it. That's something we came up with. And it describes the same thing in Genesis or in Exodus 21 that it does in the New Testament. So the New Testament identifies the Messiah of the Old Testament gospel. It tells us who it is. We know that is Yeshua. What this means now that the Messiah has come is also where we learn that in the New Testament. So we learn the need for it, what it is, and then in the New Testament we learn who it is, and then what this means to us now that the Messiah has come. How should we live? Jesus and the apostles taught the gospel using the Old Testament. They didn't have a New Testament. There was no such thing as a New Testament Bible. So we have forgotten that we have a duty to be obedient. Read the book of James, Jesus's brother. Though obedience is not a condition of our salvation, it absolutely must be our response. It's the only acceptable and correct response to the gospel. And that's the first half of Exodus 21. We'll jump into the second half next time. I hope this helps. I hope this explains a few things. If you're a little confused, that's okay. You're not supposed to completely understand this. You're supposed to be planting seeds, study more, pray more, ask the Spirit to show you more, and then we'll continue to dig into it. And hopefully here pretty soon we'll start doing some weekly discussions where we can kind of bounce some of this stuff off. But you can send me your comments, questions, anything you want to say. I love to hear it. So remember, love God, love people, and change the world.